Thanks very much, Mina. Good evening, everyone. It's great to be back at Swarthmore, and it was a great turnout at dinner and a nice turnout here as well. So I appreciate everyone spending a little bit of time with me. And I have to say, I always like coming back to Swarthmore, but it's really an incredibly exciting time to be here. What we've seen happen really over the past months, I think, is virtually unprecedented. It's been just an incredible journey to be able to watch. It's been a long road with more torturous turns and ups and downs than we can, I think, anyone could have imagined at the outset of the process. I think it's actually going to be over soon, which for some of us, you sort of say, thank God. And I also think that it's entirely possible at this point, and maybe even probable, that we are going to see history made at the end of the process. Yep, I think the Phillies are going to win the World Series. And my commitment to all of you is that we're going to get out of here in time. Thanks to the wisdom of Major League Baseball, this exciting game is going to be like a Little League game. So if you miss the beginning of the game, you might miss the whole game at the end of the day. But in all seriousness, it really is a privilege to be invited to be back here. It is an honor to be asked to deliver this lecture. And Mina, if I can take one liberty, in addition to all the wonderful things that you said about Mr. McCabe, this is a bit of a special lecture, I think, and I don't want to be maudlin about it, and there'll be dozens and dozens of these events over the course of the year, but it's a particular honor for me because this will be the last McCabe Lecture when Al Bloom is president of Swarthmore College. And I've known Al since I was a student here, and I think he's been a superb president of this institution, and he has done all of us who have anything to do with Swarthmore honor in what he has done. And so for me, it's a particular honor to be asked to deliver this lecture, and Al, it gives me an opportunity to thank you for everything you've done for this institution. So thank you. So Steve and I chose this topic on the theory, we chose it a while ago, on the theory that with a topic like this, I could talk about anything I wanted to talk about when the time came to be here. And so I'm going to talk about a few things, and hopefully they are somewhat interconnected, and hopefully maybe more importantly, they'll be a little bit interesting. But I want to start by describing my job, because I think what I do in my current position says a lot about the passions that I have, and a lot about my Swarthmore roots as well, because if Swarthmore is the place where you get the ultimate liberal arts education, and law school is a good place to go for the ultimate extension of the ultimate liberal arts education, my career, and in particular my current job, is truly the ultimate extension of a liberal arts education. So I think I have arguably the best job in corporate America. It is unlike anyone else's job. For someone like me who suffers from adult attention deficit disorder, it is the perfect job because I never have the luxury of being able to spend enough time, let alone too much time, on any particular topic. There is incredible diversity and ball juggling in what I do. People comment, if you look at my business card, it says David L. Cohen, Executive Vice President. You say, Executive Vice President of what? And the answer is there wasn't enough room on the business card to go beyond that. So I am just Executive Vice President. But I try, when I talk to folks, and this is sometimes folks within the company, about what my job is, I remind people about that famous Life cereal commercial. Let's feed it to Mikey, he'll eat anything. Well, my job is, let's give it to David, he'll do anything. And I try and divide my day and my responsibilities into three buckets at the company. The first is a strategic bucket, and I participate with basically 3 other colleagues as a member of the Management Finance Committee, which is the highest ranking committee in the company, and we are charged, or we charge ourselves with the responsibility to chart the future strategic direction of the company. What's Comcast going to be next week, next month, next year, or 5 years from now. And that's probably, I would arguably be the most interesting part of my job, the most important part of my job, the most intellectually challenging part of my job, because in all seriousness, trying to tell the future in the best of times is almost impossible, and certainly in these times of chaos, it is particularly challenging. My second bucket of responsibilities relates to the external affairs of the company, for which I have overall responsibility. Government affairs, corporate communications, community affairs, community investment, the Comcast Foundation, Comcast Political Action Committees, public policy, basically anything about the company telling its story to somebody else in the outside world falls roughly under that jurisdiction. And that gives me an opportunity to strategize and think about how we should be branded as a company, and how we talk about ourselves as a company, and how we influence public policy and public affairs in a way that is important to the company's business. And more importantly than that, it gives me an opportunity to continue to devote attention to politics and community building, and things I really learned about and first was exposed to when I was at Swarthmore, and things that were ingrained in me as things that I was both passionate about and that were important to me personally, and I think are important to the world as a whole. My third bucket of responsibilities is an administrative bucket, and in that bucket I'm responsible for corporate human resources, labor relations, real estate, security, law, internal audit, security of the company. That's really the collection of responsibilities that nobody wants. But they're important. They're important to the integrity of the company. And in that position, I get to think about and deal with corporate integrity issues and the way in which we conduct ourselves as people within a competitive corporate environment, which in this day and age is something that I think you could argue that maybe more companies should pay more attention to those sorts of issues in a corporate governance environment. So you collect that package together, and every day I get to focus on some of the most interesting, complicated, challenging, sometimes win-win, sometimes no-win situations that anyone gets to think about in corporate America. And I'm really grateful every day for Brian Roberts, who's my boss, who gave me this job, and it was a job that didn't exist at the time it was given to me, and we've sort of created it over the past 6 years or so, and it really does give me an opportunity to continue to be challenged and to continue to work in a whole host of areas that are of interest to me. Comment on the times, because I think some of what I want to talk about needs to be put in the context of the times. We are living through some unprecedented disruption in our financial markets. And we talked about this a little bit over in Parish and then at dinner. And, I don't think anyone has really seen anything like what's happened to the financial markets. Certainly not since the Depression. And arguably, what we're going through is different in a very serious way from what happened in this country during the Depression. There's been incredible market disruption, there's great consumer fear. Unlike the Depression, this was a consumer-driven financial disruption that started in the housing market. I mean, let's remember where this started. And it started from the collapse of housing values and people losing their homes, or at risk of losing their homes, and that is very, very different than the more top-down recessions that we've had historically, and the Depression, which was a top-down depression, not a bottom-up depression. And I think the complexity of this and the speed with which it has happened has resulted in unprecedented policymaker confusion. And some would say that our policymakers are always confused. I happen to not subscribe to that view, but this crisis has created some of the worst opportunities, I think, for political pandering, and has exposed some of the real weaknesses of our political process. I think we also have seen an increased and intensive suspicion of big business. And think of the corporate excesses that have been exposed over the past months and years. You've got Dick Grasso at the Stock Exchange and Bob Nardelli at Home Depot, the recent Wall Street executives. You've got ethics issues at companies like WorldCom and Enron, conflicts of interest at companies like Adelphia, pay-to-play scandals both in government and in politics, and we're seeing pay-to-play scandals play out in the papers in Philadelphia alone. And although I'm seriously concerned about all of that, and I don't mean to make light of it, I think it's important to say something that I remember a law school professor of mine saying, which is that bad facts make very bad law. And you have to be very careful about overreacting. And as a policymaker and as a constituent, I think we all have to be very careful about overreacting to some bad facts and to some really bad conduct, because you could inadvertently end up with a system that is in fact much worse. Than the problem you were trying to correct for. All that said, it would be impossible to argue that policymakers should just shrug their shoulders and wipe their hands of this and say nothing really went wrong here and we can just let this continue, because in some ways you could argue that some of what has occurred in the past few months was a result of the pendulum swinging too far in a deregulatory direction, and the system inadvertently, and I really do think it was inadvertently, encouraging untoward risk-taking and rewarding untoward risk-taking that in fact now runs the risk of causing long-term damage to the economy, which is something that is not even close to being appropriate either. So I believe that there is an appropriate balance and there's a path that can be taken here. I'm worried that our political system is not set up very well to be able to choose that path. I'm actually worried, believe it or not, about the outcome of the elections next week. Not so much the presidential elections. You know I'm a Democrat, although when I was at Swarthmore I was a Republican. But I'm a Democrat today. I think, and this is not a political speech, and I'm not going to go into this in any detail, but I think based on the campaign, we sort of forget about emotion and party identification. If you take a step back and you behave and you look at this objectively, it's hard for me to see the case that anyone other than Barack Obama has made the better case that he's ready and would be the better president of the United States. And that's not a criticism of John McCain, who I know and respect enormously. And if it were the John McCain of 8 years ago, as opposed to the John McCain of today, I might actually have a different opinion. But it's not the John McCain of 8 years ago, and that's not the campaign that was run. And so on a personal level, I'm totally comfortable with the outcome of the presidential election. What scares me to death is the outcome of the congressional elections. Because I think, and when you all watch the election results next week, you can check me on this, I think the Democrats, if you look at the trends and the patterns, are likely to pick up an additional 20 to 25 seats in the House of Representatives, which will give them a majority of 60 or 70 seats, which basically will put them in the position to do anything they want in the House of Representatives. And I think there is a more than 50-50 chance today that the Democrats will pick up 60 votes in the United States Senate, with the number of 60 being the magic number because that's the number of votes you need to stop a filibuster. And you should all be saying, well, this guy's a Democrat. He worked for Ed Rendell. What could be wrong with having a Democratic president, having the Democrats have working control of the House of Representatives, and have a filibuster-proof supermajority in the United States Senate? And the answer is, of what could be wrong with that, is that I think if you put any one party in that position, there is an almost irresistible urge to pander to the base. And I think the base of both of our parties are to the left or to the right of where the rest of the country is and where sound public policy is actually made. And I could give you dozens of examples of concerns that I would have, but I'll just pick one. And it's one I actually had a conversation with a senior Democratic member of leadership in the Congress 2 weeks ago who was expressing, we were sharing our concerns about this. And he said to me, he says, this would be a nightmare because one of the things we should do is immigration reform. mean, that's something this country needs. And if we have a Democratic House, Democratic Senate, Democratic President, we actually have a chance of getting it done. But if we've got 70 votes to spare in the House, we've got 60 votes in the Senate, I'm scared to death to do an immigration bill, because to pander to the base, I have no idea what will get added onto that bill. The height of irresponsible amendments, it will be Katie bar the door. And one thing, for example, will be the Democratic Party base is 1,000% for total amnesty. And I don't think that's sound public policy. I don't think a majority of Democrats think that that's sound public policy, but I don't think that there will be an ability to resist the temptation to be able to add that type of a provision onto an immigration bill, which then raises the question, if you're a responsible leader of the Democratic Party, if you're Barack Obama as President of the United States, can you responsibly advocate an immigration bill knowing you're going to end up with a piece of, or knowing that it is likely that you will end up with a piece of legislation that is not good for the country? So it is the outcome of the congressional elections are actually going to raise some pretty serious issues, I think, for the Democratic Party and for the country. And that's something I'm going to be watching next week, and I encourage all of you to watch that, and I assure you everyone is going to cover the Senate races, because that's the magic. There'll be all sorts of graphics. By the way, the trick on this is 60-60, because in fact, in the Senate today, the Democrats only have 49 seats. But they have 49 seats plus Senator Bernie Sanders from Vermont and Senator Joe Lieberman from Connecticut. That's what gives them their 51 votes to have control of the Senate. So arguably, 58 is 60. If the Democrats can go from 49 to 58, and it's pick up 9 seats, they would then have 60 votes if Bernie Sanders and Joe Lieberman remain a part of the Democratic caucus. I think it's likely that Bernie Sanders remains part of the Democratic caucus. You've probably seen a couple of rumblings from a couple of people who think that maybe Joe Lieberman has crossed the line by campaigning full-time for the presidential nominee, for the Republican presidential nominee. But it's fascinating to see that there is one member of the Democratic caucus who has not publicly criticized Joe Lieberman. And that one member is Harry Reid, who is the Democratic majority leader of the Senate, who understands that if the Democrats get to 59, they're going to want Joe Lieberman in the Democratic caucus, because there's a big difference between 59 and 60. So I encourage all of you to watch those numbers next week. I actually think the more interesting election is likely to be what's happening in the United States Senate, as opposed to anything else going on. When I thought about what I wanted to talk about tonight, and one of the great things about my job, one of the things that I've always enjoyed in really everything that I've done, has been the ability to focus on important public policy issues that are important to me. And my clear interest has been in urban public policy and the issues that are confronted by America's cities, and in particular by America's aging cities. And there's a great intersection between Comcast and my job at Comcast and those issues. Comcast, in addition to being the largest cable company in America, is also the most urban cable company in America. We are the largest cable provider in 22 of the 25 largest cities in America. So we have a very urban footprint. We have more people of color in our footprint than any other cable company in America. And so what happens in urban America is ironically vitally important to the health of our company, because the health of the communities where our employees live and where we all work is inextricably intertwined with the health and the financial viability of our company. I've also been able to help create some real partnerships between government and certain organizations, and between Comcast and organizations. Partnerships with organizations like the Urban League, National Council of La Raza, City Year. We even have a person who participated in City Year last year in this room, and City Year is one of my personal passions. For those who don't know City Year, in a catchword. I call it an urban Peace Corps. It combines the notion of service with the notion of saving America's cities, and it's awfully hard to disagree with either of those as policy meltdowns. And so one of the things I thought that would be a little bit of fun tonight, and I won't do the whole story, but I want to talk a little bit about Philadelphia's financial crisis from the early 1990s and its recovery from that financial crisis. So I'm going to start though by saying, why in the world? You should all be asking, why in the world would you want to talk about that? Cities everywhere, including Philadelphia, are on a fabulous roll. And is this even a relevant topic anymore? I mean, I may have lived it, and it may be one of the most important things in my life, but why should anyone else in this room have to worry about it? I mean, the common perception is that life in our city has never been better. The new hotels, the apartment vacancy rate is like 1%. We have 2 new skyscrapers in Center City. We hosted the 2000 Republican National Convention, the NBA All-Star Game, the Major League Baseball All-Star Game. We're the only city in America to host 3 Olympic qualifying events this past summer. We were named the next great American city by National Geographic magazine. We have a new and energetic and popular mayor, and hopefully in a couple of hours our team's even going to win the World Series. So you could tell that story about a number of cities, and you could then ask, well, given this great momentum, given the recovery of cities, isn't this ancient history that we don't have to worry about anymore? Well, I think there are at least 2 reasons why it's worth living in the past just a little bit. The first is that I've publicly argued repeatedly that in an era of unprecedented national prosperity, while we created millions of new jobs around the country, cities like Philadelphia did not enjoy their full and fair share of this vaunted national recovery. I've suggested in even stronger words that all of the citizens and neighborhoods of America's cities did not share equally in the alleged boom economic times that represented the financial recovery of the past 10 or 15 years. And it was my view, and I really thought this was tragic, that the good economic times had literally papered over many of the underlying problems of American cities. Using Philadelphia as an example, I've analogized the city of Philadelphia to a patient with a gunshot wound and terminal cancer. And when Ed Rendell was elected mayor of Philadelphia and we went into office, we did an A+ job of treating that gunshot wound. We saved the patient. The patient did not die. And that was the good news. The bad news is the patient still had terminal cancer, and neither we, well, I don't want to say neither we, but we could not do anything to fix that, and nobody else seemed to give it to him. And that same thing could be said not just for Philadelphia, but for the rest of the country. And as much as I like Barack Obama, as much as I respect John McCain, I want you all to think about all the things of urban public policy you've heard expressed in this year's presidential campaign. Does anyone remember anyone talking about the problems of American cities? It hasn't even been a part of the dialogue. I think the sad thing is that with the financial crisis that we've seen, I think you're going to see the financial crisis come back to American cities with a vengeance. We've got Michael Bloomberg saying he's got a $6 billion budget hole. Michael Nutter in Philadelphia announced 3 weeks ago that he had a $450 million problem, 2 weeks ago that he had an $850 million problem, and next week he's going to have a press conference and he's going to talk about all the horrible things he has to do to be able to balance the budget. And what's worse about it today as compared to 20 years ago or 18 years ago when Ed Rendell was elected is that nobody even knows there's a problem. It's been 18 years of complacency where everyone thinks it's fine and they see the new office buildings and they'll see the parade for the Phillies and they'll think everything's fine. And lots of things are fine, but everything is not fine, and I think that's why it's worth talking about this issue again. I also think that some of the lessons that came out of that financial crisis, lessons about leadership, lessons about how to work together to solve problems, are lessons that have great applicability in public policy and in business and in life. And so I think it's worth talking about them as well. So now that I've justified what I wanted to talk about, let me spend a little time talking about it. So 18 years ago, Philadelphia was facing a $250 million annual budget deficit, with the cumulative budget deficit at the end of 5 years projected to grow to $1.4 billion. City and State magazine castigated Philadelphia as the municipality, and I quote here, that sets the standard for municipal distress in the 1990s. Barron's magazine described Philadelphia's municipal government, and I quote again, as a financial horror tale. And Philadelphia became the first major city in America to have its debt classified at junk levels. As a result, the capital budgets closed down. Philadelphia had no money to repair streets or bridges. When Ed was elected mayor, there were 14 bridges in the city of Philadelphia that simply had been closed down because they were structurally unsafe and there was no money available to be able to fix those bridges. Now, by the time Ed Rendell left office in 2000, 8 years later, Philadelphia had enjoyed 7 consecutive balanced budgets and enjoyed a cumulative surplus that was well over $250 million. Today, at least before the current financial meltdown, the city's budget remains in financial balance, and in fact, fund balance, the city's cumulative surplus at the end of John Street's term as mayor was still in excess of $250 million. And not only do we have a balanced budget, but I think most people would agree the city looks great. I mean, city services were back functioning, the streets are clean, swimming pools were open, streets were being paved that hadn't seen paving crews in 40 or 50 years. Our libraries were open 6 days a week. We had more rec centers functioning at a higher degree and a higher level of services. Record number of kids in organized sports league. Record level of funding from the local government for public schools in the city of Philadelphia. So we balanced the budget, we made structural reforms, and we really had the place operating at a reasonable level. In addition, while taxes have been going up in the suburbs and in most American cities, Philadelphians this year are enjoying their 14th consecutive year of wage and business tax reductions, building since 1996 when the city cut the wage tax for the first time in over 50 years. From fiscal years 96 through 2009, the current fiscal year, Philadelphians will have enjoyed more than $1.5 billion in tax cuts. So we sort of proved the story that you could cut taxes, still increase revenues, and be able to operate a city reasonably and responsibly. So how did we do that? What was our approach in 1992? Municipal finance is not rocket science. It is not that much different than balancing your checkbook or your household budget. We're not the federal government. The federal government is a wonderful place to be. If you run out of money, just print some. And worry about someone else will come along later to be able to pay it back. Cities and states can't function like that. They really only can spend the money that they have at the end of the day. And the system comes crashing down around you, as it did in Philadelphia, if you get yourself structurally out of balance. So there are a limited number of things that you can look at to be able to balance a municipal budget. So we started with the easiest one, the one that everyone had used before, and that was to raise taxes. And that was viewed by the mayor as being the absolute last resort. I'm going to try everything else before I do this, because I think if we continue to raise taxes, we will kill the economic tax base of the city and we'll never be able to recover from it. The second is to slash spending and services across the board. Close the libraries. Libraries are a luxury. Some people actually said that. And so you just cut your spending. Cut it wherever you can to be able to bring your spending in line with your revenues. And like cutting taxes, the mayor said, we can't do that. I mean, people live in a city because it's vibrant, it's exciting. And if you go and you cut the level of services and you make the city a black hole in the middle of a donut, no one's going to live here. We'll chase our tax base out just as much by doing that. And so the only other choice is to make the government more efficient, to collect the tax revenues that were due to us, to run the government like a business, like a rational business, to make rational decisions, and to see if you could cut enough waste out of the operation of the government, enough inefficiency to be able to balance the budget. And so that was the basic frame that we used to solve the city's financial crisis. So let me put a little bit of color around that and first talk about a fundamental paradigm shift that we made in how we constructed a city budget. Historically, cities and states, by the way, used to budget in a very simple way. Take last year's spending, figure out how much the expense would go up, what were your wage increases, what are your supplies and services going to go up, inflate the budget by that amount, look at your tax revenue and say, okay, how much do we have to increase taxes to be able to cover that nut? In Philadelphia, that particular model of budgeting resulted in 19 tax increases in 11 years. And the problem with that approach is that it ignores the fact that your tax base is not captive. And that if you raise taxes, if you become uncompetitive with your tax base, people will leave. Businesses will leave, residents will leave, they will go somewhere else where the taxes are lower. And so that tax increases, all you can do is raise the rate of taxes. You can't guarantee a revenue increase. You raise the rate that gets applied against the base, and if part of your base leaves, you don't get the revenues that you originally projected. So we flipped that on its head. We said, we're not going to start with last year's budget. What we're going to start with is last year's revenues. How much money are we going to have to spend? We're not going to raise the tax rate. So we're going to take last year's revenues, we're going to look at how many more jobs are going to leave the city, how many more people are going to leave the city, an inflationary increase in the wage rate, an inflationary increase in property values, and we're going to see that's how much money we have to spend. And then we're going to go department by department, and we're going to figure out how much it costs us to do what those departments do. And then we're going to prioritize them, and we're going to go and we're going to draw a line in every department when we run out of money. And that's going to be our budget. And so when we get to the lower priority items we don't have the money for, we're going to stop spending the money at that point. This sounds logical. I hope it sounds logical to you. In some ways, I think it's sort of the way you make your own spending decisions. At the time, this was viewed as revolutionary. In fact, it was written up in all the good government books. Gee whiz, Philadelphia actually is doing something that no government's ever done before. They're actually only going to spend the amount of money that they have and they're not going to spend more than that, and continue to make basically expenditure side decisions about the structure of the budget. If you think about incentives that historically exist in governmental budgeting, they're exactly the wrong incentive. So let's think about the way in which, let's think about, if you think about a typical governmental organization, who are the most important officials in the government? They're the people who are the heads of the biggest departments. So the most important officials in the government, people have the largest budgets. Well, how do they get the largest budgets? Let's take a police department by way of example. A police department gets larger when the crime rate is higher. So what's the police department supposed to do? It's supposed to lower the crime rate. So we're actually, ironically, inadvertently, we're rewarding a department and a police commissioner for failure by saying if you do a really lousy job, we'll increase your budget so you can hire more police to be able to bring the crime rate down. As opposed to focusing maybe on more innovative crime prevention techniques, maybe on interdepartmental cooperation, on whether the problem is that we're not putting enough people in prisons, and so maybe you have to increase a prison budget to be able to take people off the street, and maybe you don't need all those extra police officers. Maybe we have too many police officers sitting behind desks or wiping the floor or sweeping the floor, and therefore we may have enough people in the police department, they're just not being deployed in the appropriate way. So I could give dozens and dozens of specifics around how we undergirded that philosophical approach, but that was the philosophical approach. Figure out how much money you have, only spend that amount of money, and wring inefficiencies out of the government. So I just want to tell a few stories, and I am going to control myself, I promise, because these are the kinds of stories you can tell all night. And some night you might even enjoy them, but tonight is not the night. So I want to divide my story into two parts, what I'll call the management side of the government and the labor side of the government. And let me start on the management side because it was crystal clear to us that this was a government that was not being managed very well, and that you could go on the management side and save real money. And just two stories on the management side. One is, and this is, I was talking before, and I sort of shook my head realizing I graduated here in 1977, which was 31 years ago, which is a little frightening. And I don't feel that old, and maybe I'm not that old. Maybe I've lost count of the years somehow. But let's forget about 1977. Ed Rendell walked into office in January of 1992. In the mayor's office, there was one computer. It was not plugged in. The old mayor liked having a computer on his desk. Literally was not plugged in. He had never used it. Ed Rendell had no idea how to use a computer. But more important, this is 1992. This is not 1977. More importantly than that, the city's tax collection system was a paper-based system. There was zero computerization. And not only that, every tax was accounted for separately. So there was a room where the city's business privilege tax was accounted for. That room was a wall of filing cabinets with drawers with index cards in. And if you wanted to go and say, okay, what business taxes did Comcast Corporation pay, you would go, it's like a library catalog. I mean, are there library catalogs anymore? I don't know if they exist anymore. But it was like the old library catalogs. You would go, you would find a drawer, you would pull open, you'd find Comcast, and there would be 17 4x6 index cards with handwriting. 1968 $1,416.88. That's how our tax records were kept. Zero computerization. It was our estimate, based on nothing, that there was a minimum of $250 million a year of taxes that were due and owing to the city that were not being collected. And we computerized, we invested in computerized the tax system. In the second year that Ed was mayor, we did a computerized tax match against the federal tax returns of everyone with a Philadelphia zip code who had filed a federal tax return. And we found $200 million of unpaid wage taxes over the past 3 years. $200 million, about $70 million a year of people who lived in Philadelphia who were filing federal tax returns and somehow were not paying local wage taxes. So that's purely management. That has nothing to do with the workforce. That just has to do with bringing some common sense and logic and technology into play. On average, over the 8 years that Ed Rendell was mayor, we collected an additional $75 to $100 million in taxes that were previously not being paid to the city. Second example, and again, I could do 20, but I promised you only 2. Second example dealt with the city's lease portfolio. At the time Ed Rendell took office, the city had over 1,000 real estate leases. By the way, the only reason I knew that is because we had a private sector task force, a group of business executives that helped us to review city practices. We had a real estate group that looked into the city's real estate portfolio because although the city had over 1,000 leases, nobody knew that. Nobody knew how many they were, nobody knew what buildings were covered, nobody knew what rents were being paid, nobody knew the terms of the leases. And the private sector task force helped us to get this organized, computerized, and again, all in a place where we could review this. What we discovered was that there's an obscure provision, not an obscure provision, there's a provision in the Philadelphia Home Rule Charter that says that any contract for more than a year, that goes more than a year in length, you have to bring to city council. And one of the conventional wisdom of mayors in the city of Philadelphia is bring nothing to city council. Do everything you can to avoid city council. And so of these 1,000 leases, 99% of them were one-year leases. Now, it's hard to do a one-year lease with a landlord because the landlord doesn't want somebody for a year. They're trying to get a long-term tenant. They don't want to have to go through this every year. So the very tricky way that multiple city administrations had gotten away with this over the years is they would enter into an evergreen lease with a landlord. So it would be a lease for a term of 1 year. And the lease would provide that in the event neither side canceled the lease, 60 days or 90 days before the termination of the term, it would renew for another year, automatically. And of course the landlord says, well, I've got this evergreen, so I have to have a rent escalator. And so there would be a rent escalator. The rent would go up 2.5%, 5%, 10%, 18%, depending on what year the lease was entered into. And the city solicitor had issued an opinion in the 60s that these types of evergreen leases did not violate the Home Rule Charter's provision on provision on one-year leases. So now that we knew what the leases were, we looked at them, and I'll never forget the day when Tom Knox, who was our deputy mayor for management and productivity, ran for mayor in Philadelphia last year. A little bit made him sound like he had saved the city of Philadelphia without the help of Ed Rendell or anyone else, but was crazy about that part of his campaign. But the one thing that was absolutely true is if any of you remember his TV ads, he talked about straightening out the city's lease situation, which he actually helped to do. And I'll never forget him coming into my office with a letter. And the letter was written to a very significant campaign contributor of Ed Rendell's. It had a signature line with my name on it. And it was, Dear Dr. So-and-so. I'm not going to go any further than that. We are hereby providing you with notice that pursuant to the terms of the lease dated such and such 1968, we are exercising our right to terminate the lease. And I looked at the address, and I knew the address, I knew the building. It was a building I could see out of my office. It was a 22-story building with about 2,000 city employees in it. It was I like to call it a Class F building. It was not a building that any of you would like to go into, let alone work in. It was just horrible, a rat hole. And I said, Tom, what are we doing? Where are we moving all these people? He said, well, I don't want to move them. I said, well, why would you do the lease? And he told me the story. He said, this was one of those evergreen leases. And it was entered into 15 years ago. It's renewed every year for 15 years. It had an escalator of 12% on the rent. And this lease is about to renew for $42.50 a foot. At the time, space in One Liberty, which was the premier building in downtown Philadelphia, space was going for $21.50 a foot. So he says, the only way I know how to renegotiate it is I'm going to terminate the lease. And he's going to go crazy. And we'll go in and we'll renegotiate it, and we'll renegotiate terms. So I said, got it, great idea, great plan, sign the letter. Sure enough, 48 hours later, he's on the phone screaming, David, what are you doing? How can you move these people? You'll bankrupt me. What am I going to do? I said, look, we don't need to move these people, but the rental rate is ridiculous. He says, I don't even know what the rental rate is. I said, trust me, it's ridiculous. Make a long story short, 3 weeks of negotiations, we renewed the lease for $2.50 a foot. $42.50, $2.50 a foot. Wow. We rolled that out for the city's entire lease portfolio, saved $25 million a year. Wow. In simply renegotiating existing leases of the city of Philadelphia. So again, hundreds of stories like that. I'll skip to the labor side of the equation. Always nervous talking about this because, in any audience, by the way, certainly a Swarthmore audience, but even a business audience, because taking on the labor unions was something that was anathema to Ed Rendell and almost anathema to me. It's not something we were comfortable doing culturally. It isn't the background that we came from. But the fact of the matter is, the city of Philadelphia was on the verge of bankruptcy. 68% of our costs were labor costs, and there was no way we could balance the city's budget without a fundamental renegotiation of a contractual relationship, and in fact, the very workplace management relationship between the unions and management of the city. I've never blamed the unions, and I certainly don't blame the municipal workers for having successfully negotiated a package of the worst collective bargaining agreements in the history of the world in the city of Philadelphia. Because all you can do as a union representative is ask. The mayor has to say yes. And if the mayor says yes to every ridiculous request that you make, why wouldn't you come back and ask for more? And I certainly can't blame the municipal workers who were simply working under the terms of contracts that their union leaders had negotiated with previous administrations and previous mayors. But the facts of the matter were that our collective bargaining agreements were out of control. There were, on the day Ed Rendell took office, every city worker had 16 paid holidays. I used to go out to audiences at community meetings just like this, and I don't have time to do it tonight, and I said, name 16 paid holidays that a municipal worker can have. Now, everyone did fine up to 9 or 10, or thereabouts. The last ones that they never got were we were the only government body in America that gave off President's Day, Washington's birthday, and Lincoln's birthday. Last I heard, when you put in President's Day, you got rid of Lincoln and Washington's birthday and you added Martin Luther King Day. That was the whole purpose of it. You had Lincoln and Washington, and so to get Martin Luther King recognized, you do 1 day for President's Day, 1 day for Martin Luther King. In Philadelphia, we ended up with 4. The other one that nobody ever got was your birthday. Every municipal employee in Philadelphia writes their birthday. Think about trying to run a business where I'm not coming in tomorrow and I'm getting paid. It's my birthday. And again, I don't mean to beat up on the unions when I say this. I'm going to do one other story here, which is how did we create an environment to be able to negotiate this? Because nobody understood this. And the last thing we wanted to do was to get a reputation for bashing the unions. So one of the things we did is we went out to our workers. By the way, I should point out they're pure economic terms of contracts: wages, benefits, pension funds, paid holidays. Those are pure economic terms. But the other really important thing in labor contracts are what are called past practices and work rules. And they can really drive the cost of the workforce even more than the pure economic matters. So we went out to our managers and we said, identify all the work rules and past practices that prevent you from doing your job in an efficient manner, in the way in which you think it should be done. And there was a guy who was our deputy mayor for policy and planning. It's a guy named Joe Torsella, who's now president of the National Constitution Center. And he was charged with the responsibility of assembling all these work rules and past practices in a memo. The memo was this thick. And every one of them was worse than the next. You read them and you shake your head. You have no idea how you got there. And so when we had a meeting and said, okay, then what do we do with this? We decided to gin up some public outrage that we would leak the memo. And we leaked the memo to a few places, but the first institution to pick up on it was the Wall Street Journal, which liked Ed Rendell. Wall Street Journal was and still is fairly conservative, Republican, pro-business publication, but they loved Ed Rendell, Democrat who's taken on the unions, making the tough decisions, and he probably wrote 10 editorials about Ed, favorable editorials in his first term. By his second term, by the way, they had turned on him, but in the first term we were the darling of the Wall Street Journal, and they loved this memo. And they ran, this is probably the most famous story that was written about the Rendell administration in March or April of 1992. They ran a story on the front page of the journal, the headline of which was based on this memo, sort of told the story of 10 of these horrible work rules and past practices. The headline on the story was, how many workers does it take to change a light bulb at Philadelphia International Airport? The answer to that question, by the way, was 5. And the reason for that is as follows. Under the work rules that existed at the airport, the only person who could touch a light bulb was an electrician. So you have an electrician who takes the light bulb, you have the light bulb out, okay, you got to walk out to the concourse, change the light bulb. The problem is the light bulb is sort of, it's not like these where you can actually reach them. There's a fixture over the bulbs. So you have to take the fixture off. Well, electricians can't do that because they're screwed on. You need a screwdriver, only a carpenter can use a screwdriver. So the electrician goes out with a light bulb, and the carpenter with a screwdriver to be able to do it. But they're up high, so you can't reach them from the floor. You need a ladder. Well, only a laborer 1 can carry a ladder. So you have a laborer 1 carrying the ladder. You have a laborer 1 carrying the ladder. By the way, laborer 1 also carries the broom to be able to sweep up afterwards. The carpenter carrying the screwdriver, and the electrician carrying the light bulb. The problem is you need a laborer 2 You need a laborer or two to hold when someone climbs up on a ladder, two people have to hold the ladder. It's the same thing. So you need two laborers to be there to hold the ladder for the carpenter to climb up, unscrew the fixture, carpenter to come down, electrician to go up, screw in the light bulb, carpenter to go back up, screw on the fixture. So that's 4. So well, how would the 5th be? Work rule at the airport. If you have a work crew of 4 or more, supervisors. This was true. This was true. And there were 250 of these interspersed throughout the entire government that needed to be wiped out as a part of those contract negotiations. And as Ed Rendell used to say at the end of those negotiations, no municipal worker was hurt in terms of his quality of life by ending up with only 14 paid holidays, fully paid health, medical, dental, and vision coverage for himself or herself and his or her family. A pension plan untouched, vacation period untouched, no layoffs, no rollbacks in salaries, and a rational set of work rules that enable the basic work of the city to get done on a reasonably efficient basis. So, in the end, the Philadelphia recovery is a pretty compelling story. The New York Times called it the most stunning municipal turnaround in history, and that's been great for Philadelphia, I think, and it's been great for Ed Rendell, and it's been great for me. I mean, I think it's a wonderful story, and it's helped us as a city to become a poster child of something that was successful, instead of a poster child of distress and a poster child of a joke. But I think the most enduring lesson from our turnaround, and the real reason to tell the story, is the ultimate value of vision, leadership, and courage. There's no secret about what a fan of Ed Rendell I am, but I saw him within this crucible. I saw him, he's still a young elected official who still had political aspirations, be threatened by national union leaders and by the Democratic National Committee that they would kill his career in government if he did not cave in to the unions. I saw him stand up to incredible pressure. I saw him be at his beloved Palestra watching Penn play basketball and getting picketed by a group of people who were upset about his temporary closure of a library in South Philadelphia that was literally across the street from another branch library. Literally across the street. And I saw how he was willing to stand up to it, how he was willing to take it, and how he was willing to how he was willing to basically strap an unwilling city council and a staff of people who sort of believed but didn't really know what we were getting into on his back and say, we're going to do the right thing and we're going to make this work. And I think in the end it was his vision and his leadership that defined the Philadelphia turnaround. And I get to talk about leadership and I get to talk about vision in a lot of different settings, mostly in the corporate setting now. And I like telling the story because I think the Ed Rendell leadership traits and his vision is totally transferable to the business side. I think it's totally transferable to the private sector. And I think in my own career, in my own life, I've seen how the skills that I learned as being a relatively young, maybe even a very young, chief of staff in an administration that nobody really knew what the outcome was going to be at the time we started, how that skill set has served me so well as I've moved into the private sector. And so I think in a way, it's that intersection, to go back to the title of the talk tonight. It is the intersection and the fact that ultimately leadership skills and vision are arguably the most important traits that you can bring to any job, whether they're in government or whether they're in the private sector. And I think if you lead effectively, if you've got courage, if you act with integrity, you can be a success in no matter what environment you seek to function. And I think that is the ultimate lesson of the Philadelphia turnaround. So thanks very much for giving me all this time.